Hey guys, it's Canuck here. This will be a retrospective review of Resident Evil. This review will only cover the original black box release of Resident Evil 1 for the PlayStation. This review will not cover the Director's Cut or the DualShock releases of the game. That's for two reasons. Firstly, the soundtrack was changed in both versions, and not entirely for the better. Secondly, even though I do have both the Director's Cut and the original black box release of the game, I don't usually play the Director's Cut version. Furthermore, this review does not cover the Resident Evil remake. That's a topic for a different day. It requires its own separate review. Today, I'm just going to be covering the original game. There's a lot to cover here, so let's get started. Sweet Home mutates into Resident Evil. Any gamer that was around in the 90s knows that it was a very experimental time in gaming history. Prior to the 90s, playing games with 3D animation was laughable, expensive, and to casual players, it was unheard of. Frankly, 2D gaming was cheaper to develop, more accessible to gamers, and pandered to a wider family-style audience. In general, 2D gaming was the commonality of the time. Occasionally, computers offered a stepping stone into 3D gaming, but even that was limited at first. A lot of games that looked 3D weren't. They just looked that way, using clever techniques and tricks of the eye. Sony changed that with the release of the PlayStation. The powerhouse of a system opened doors for developers, and allowed gamers a glimpse into what fully realized worlds might look like. Capcom, a Japanese video game developer, had the bold idea to bring one of their classic games over to the new console. Its name was Sweet Home. Now, here's a little food for thought. Sweet Home was a title for the Family Entertainment System. It was made in 1989, so everything about it was made with the older platform in mind. Bringing it into a 3D space was going to be a monumental effort. The game was a fusion containing both RPG and horror elements. Knowing this would not be an easy task, Capcom asked Shinji Mikami to help them with the project. To say that the project was a massive undertaking would be selling the matter short. Everything was against them in this effort. Sweet Home was a complex game with multiple storylines and very intricately created puzzles. They couldn't just upheave the general concept and then proceed to cram it into a 3D environment. That surely would have ended in complete disaster. Thankfully, that's not what they did. Instead, the ideas and themes of Sweet Home took on a life of their own. Eventually, from the ashes of all those great ideas, a new game was born. It was known as Biohazard in Japan. Unfortunately, there was another problem. They couldn't use the name. A DOS game had already registered that name for a different brand, so Capcom just couldn't use it. Capcom eventually renamed the title and it became Resident Evil. The game, in a word, was masterful. There were plenty of horror games to play at the time, but none of them quite like this one. With the release of Resident Evil, so too came the birth of survival horror. An aside, a plethora of you died screens. I was young when I began my Resident Evil journey. The first game I ever beat on my own was Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. Prior to that, I didn't have the skills required to beat the games. I tried, of course, but I always needed help. Resident Evil 3 Nemesis had a freakishly low skill requirement on easy mode. With tons of weapons and ammo in the item box at the start of the game, it's actually pretty difficult to die. I mean, unless you just stand there and let a zombie eat you. As a general rule, survival horror is not an easy genre to play. It's generally made for adults. It's not aimed at kids, nor should it be. I played the genre as a child, but I had an older brother that was usually with me. Forcing myself to focus on the cognitive puzzle solving, basic game controls, memorizing maps, and recalling enemy layouts were some of the hardest things I ever had to do in a game. This is why I say that playing these games helped me more than I could have ever perceived as a child. They were foundational tools for many of the skills I became able to do after holding a controller and thinking outside of the box. After playing Resident Evil 3 Nemesis on easy, normal, and finally hard difficulty, I was able to go back to the older games in the genre and play them on my own. Before that, I usually never made it beyond the mansion in Resident Evil 1 or the police station in Resident Evil 2. Before that, poor inventory management, terrible ammo conservation, and a lack of ink ribbons usually did me in. I really want to highlight that because I want you to understand how my gameplay experience influenced my love of the series. So that's why I prefaced all of that. Entering the nightmare. Entering into Resident Evil, a bizarre string of murders runs rampant. Victims are being eaten alive. Resident Evil features a fairly typical story. A rescue mission is taking place, with a string of murders running rampant across the fictional Raccoon City. It's up to the police to find out what is really going on, and in response to this, the Special Tactics and Rescue Service, or STARS, have been sent to look into the issue. Having been sent deep into the mountains, the first team has gone missing. When starting the game, players get to choose between two characters. Both of them are STARS officers. One is a man by the name of Chris Redfield. The other is a woman by the name of Jill Valentine. Each one has their own story, and it serves the player to go through each scenario at least once. No matter what character you pick, you have a few not-so-simple tasks. First, you must find the missing Bravo STARS team members. At the very least, you must find out what happened to them. Secondly, you must find out what has been happening deep in the Arklay Mountains, just northwest of Raccoon City. Thirdly, you have to survive the ordeal and come out of it alive. The opening cinematic is the same for both characters. You find out that the other team's helicopter has been heavily damaged and no one is around. A pack of deranged zombie dogs attack the group. In a desperate attempt to survive the attack, the Alpha team members make a mad dash to the nearby mansion. They hide inside where they believe it will be safe. Instead, they've walked headlong into a nightmare. The virus has spread throughout the entire mansion, infecting everything from humans, dogs, plants, spiders, and more. Getting down to the basics. The mansion itself is a labyrinth of narrow hallways, a maze that needs to be traversed bit by bit, carefully and with an eye out for looming dangers. Tight camera angles and tank controls keep the player on their toes. Now I'll say this, a lot of people complain about tank controls. In the current era of gaming, I agree they can be a bit clunky. That said, I've never had an issue with them. In fact, they were almost second nature to me. For me, I had more of a problem with inventory management and trying not to use up all my ammo. The game takes small cues from Sweet Home, Alone in the Dark, and other such driven horror titles. With limited inventory and never enough ammo, players will be forced to explore many areas to find items they need in order to progress. Certain keys have to be acquired, and backtracking will happen more than once. This was a risky design decision, but I'm glad it worked so well. Typewriters for saving and item boxes for inventory management will be utilized often. Thankfully, they have been placed carefully in areas that players will visit often enough as they're passing throughout the game, so there's no issues there. On the topic of item boxes and typewriters specifically, they're instrumental in playing Resident Evil. These are core game mechanics across most of the titles. Space on your character is limited, and it is imperative that you plan accordingly. In order to save your game, you require ink ribbons, and you usually find them in small batches. Every time you save your game, it costs an ink ribbon. The supply is limited, and on the first playthrough, you might find yourself running out. The ink ribbon is a double-edged sword, though. Higher-end game rankings require faster completion times, fewer saves, and less healing items. Thanks to constant puzzle solving, there's a sense of adventure woven into the narrative. To be honest, it couples nicely with the campy dialogue and nods to classic horror as a genre. Nowadays, the original Resident Evil might be too campy, but I still enjoy it. I think it works well given the graphics of the era. Newcomers need to remember that the PlayStation era was before high-fidelity graphics were even possible in gaming. In my opinion, the goofy dialogue only adds to the charm. In some ways, it has even helped the game to age well. Back in the day, there were some parts of the game I had a hard time taking seriously. Nowadays, I think that's actually impossible. I feel like everyone has that moment when they want to laugh out loud at least once. For me, that reason alone makes it an experience worth playing. So let's talk about the combat. Really, there is only one form of combat in Resident Evil. You can either aim your gun and shoot, or choose to run away. Both options have their place, and it's important to know what option best suits the situation. Skilled players can do no-save, knife-only runs, but that isn't something an average player will master. Certainly not on their first try. Learning the contours of the mansion will help you to make these all-too-important decisions. You can't murder every enemy in the entire game. Your ammo is limited, and this key fact is what defines survival horror as a genre. Well, that and the tank controls for earlier titles, I suppose. Your job is simply to survive by any means necessary. Choosing a live and let live approach comes in handy inside wide open rooms. Outmaneuvering slow enemies will conserve ammunition. Narrow hallways will require a more aggressive approach though. In those sorts of hallways, sometimes it's just better to take the zombies down. Especially since I'm talking about the original game and not the remake. The remake is definitely a different story though. Due to the stationary camera angles and tank controls, sometimes enemies will be hiding just off camera. The developers planned for that, giving every monster in the game some sort of audio cue. They were careful to make every sound distinct and clear against the ambient music of the soundtrack. Zombies have their moans, dogs growl, hunters make clicking noises whenever they walk, and so on. Even boss fights like Yawn have carefully placed cues to warn you about what kind of attack is coming. In general, careful players can usually avoid getting attacked by a monster off-screen. All they need to do is wait and listen. If you take damage from an enemy, you'll have to rely on herbs and first aid sprays to heal you. They're in short supply, and every time you get hit, you put yourself into a sticky situation. Your character will begin to hold their side if their injury is bad enough. If they continue to take damage, they'll begin to limp slowly, and this makes avoiding enemies difficult. There are several boss battles, of course. Yawn is a battle you fight twice. With the right weapons and preparation, they're never too hard. If you conserve your ammo properly, the bosses shouldn't be your largest threat. In fact, I'd say most boss battles in the game aren't that big of a threat at all. Instead, I'd say that forgetting where you might have left a zombie or two is a much bigger problem. Backtracking after a battle can be a death sentence, especially if you're low on ammo and healing items. On to some final thoughts. The first Resident Evil game is a true classic among survival horror fans, and the genre itself. It isn't insanely difficult, but it doesn't forgive reckless new players either. The game has a stiff learning curve, and it expects you to rise above every puzzle, enemy, and trap that it gives you. The game is atmospheric in the best ways, utilizing visual assets in a way few games could back then. The musical design is flawless in the original black box edition of the game, ambient and often beautiful. The musical quality is abysmal when it comes to the director's cut or the DualShock releases of the game. Sadly, that's the trade-off you make if you can't get a copy of the original. The voice acting is campy at best and embarrassingly bad at worst, but a lot of the dialogue became a touchstone for gamers around the world. People attended anime cons and gaming conventions cosplaying these characters. Fanfiction flooded websites and fan art followed soon after. Best of all, nowadays speedrunners collectively band together to experience the game, giving rise to an entirely new audience of survival horror fans. All of that cannot be understated. Obviously, with the original game being remade, we got to revisit the mansion once more with the Resident Evil remake for the GameCube back in 2002. Many people prefer the remake over the original. I certainly do as well. The remake eventually received a PC port, which is by far the most visually impressive way to enjoy the game, but I'll talk about that later. That said, returning to the original game every now and then is vastly important to gaming history. Survival horror as a genre would be completely different than it is today without the original Resident Evil. This has been Kernook of the Demented Ferrets, where stupidity is at its finest and level grinds are par for the course. And I will definitely see you in another video, whenever that happens to be.